Hey everybody, Pastor James back with another edition of Life Group Live. Over the next 4 weeks, I'll be bringing you a series on the book of Jonah. Each week, I'll cover a different chapter, give you some key insights on the book, some of the meaning behind some of the verses, and leave you with some questions to ponder either by yourself, with your family, or with your life group. So join us over the next 4 weeks as we take a deep dive into the book of Jonah. Let's jump right in to the first chapter. Jonah's a very odd book. Jonah was a prophet. We sometimes get some backstory on the prophets, but Jonah was one of the prophets that we don't know that much about. He's referenced in the book of 2 Kings. Jesus actually makes reference to him at least once. But other than that, this book is all that we know of Jonah, and it doesn't have really any backstory at all. What we do know is that it starts pretty immediately with God's call. And that's what we've been studying the past few weeks, is this concept of trying to hear God's voice. And I thought, what better way than to jump into a book that is really all about listening to the voice of God. So I would call your attention to verse 2. We see immediately Jonah gets that call from God. It says here, let me back up. I'll just read from verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. So immediately we see Jonah's been called by God to go and do his job as a prophet. And in verse 3, we see again immediately his response, which is this: Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So, of course, Jonah's response is to not listen at all. Matter of fact, he turns and runs the complete opposite way as far as he can. We do that sometimes. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to look at this, because here we have a man whose job it is to listen to the voice of God, to listen for the voice of God. And we have a response that I think a lot of us can actually relate to. The rest of chapter 1 is kind of the setup for the story that we hear most of the time, like in Sunday school, or that we're told as a child. The rest of the story involves him actually getting on the boat at Joppa. He goes down in the belly of the vessel, down in the ship. He takes a nap. And while he's taking a nap, a storm brews, massive storm. All of the sailors on board kind of freak out. They pray to the various gods that the story tells us that they worship different gods, so they're praying to those gods and asking for deliverance from the storm. At one point, they cast lots. They essentially call on a divine spirit to guide them to where the issue is on the boat, why they're caught in this storm. And the lots fall on Jonah. Essentially, this divination tool that they use points in the direction of Jonah. And Jonah confesses. He says, yeah, it's me. I'm the reason that we're dealing with this. My God called me to do something, and I ran away from him. He says, as a matter of fact, just throw me overboard. So that's the gist of chapter 1. Jonah runs from God. Jonah essentially gets caught in this storm and sacrifices himself. And chapter 1 ends with him being swallowed up by a large fish. We always kind of stylize that as a whale, because that seems to be the only thing, I think, in common parlance we can think of that could swallow a person. But a large fish nonetheless. And he ends up there for 3 days and 3 nights. A lot of symbolism there. I'm sure you guys can look into that and peg some symbolism there. But Jonah ends up in the belly of the whale. Now, I want to give you some key insights that I discovered while looking into this book, looking specifically into this passage. 3 things that I want to share with you before we move on to the questions. The first is, this is what it looks like to hear from God. And not to spoil the rest of the story, but there does come a point where Jonah listens to and heeds the call of God. But what we do have is a passage from, like I said, someone whose job it is to actually listen for the voice of God. in our everyday lives, if we're looking at an example of what it's like to listen for the voice of God, we can find really no better example of what it looks like to hear the voice of God, what it looks like to run from that calling, what it looks like to hear that calling, and act on it. So while we study this for the next 4 weeks, I want you to keep in mind this is a great picture of what it looks like to listen for and hear the voice of God and the different ways that we can react to that. The second thing that you discover when you read through this chapter, and by the way, I would suggest that everyone read through at least this first chapter. You can actually read through the entirety of the book over the course of a few minutes. It's not very long. It's normally just one page front and back. But as you read through, one question that kind of comes up is, why was Jonah running? In essence, why was Jonah running from a God that's so all-powerful, so all-present? Where did he think he was running to, I guess, is the real question. And there's a few cultural explanations for that. One of them is that at this time, there was a belief that gods really only had domain over the place they were most present. That is to say, Yahweh, the God of Isaac and Jacob, the one that Jonah worshipped and listened to, was mainly present in Israel. That's where most of that recorded history comes from. So the idea, at least culturally, would have been that that's kind of where he stayed. He stayed around the temple. He stayed around Israel. And I think Jonah maybe knew intellectually that wasn't the case. Like, he knew in his head and from reading that God was the God of creation. He actually tells the sailors that at one point in time. This is the God of creation, the God that created land and sea. And he knows this, but I think maybe there was still some residual belief in him that there was a boundary to God's power, that he could somehow run outside that. The other thing is that he was trying to physically distance himself, not only from Israel, not only from God, but away from his target, which would have been Nineveh. It would have been Nineveh. So he goes to Tarshish, which some people actually believe, some scholars believe, that is actually Tyre in Spain. And the important thing about that is that sailing from the port in Joppa, where he sailed from, Tarshish would have been quite possibly the furthest west he could have gone away from Nineveh. So he was quite literally physically running in the opposite direction as far as he could go from what God had called him to do. So that explains maybe the human side of why he was running. The truth of the matter is, Jonah finds out there's no running from God. And like I said, intellectually he knows that. He tells the sailors, look, I worship the God that's the God of creation. There's no outrunning him. Throw me overboard. And Jonah knows this, but it becomes very apparent during this time. The other thing is this. Why was Jonah running? Why did he not want to go to Nineveh? And there's a few explanations that I hear. Maybe he was unsure. Jonah was unsure. And like I said, that's a very common response, I think, for most of us that try and listen to the voice of God. Maybe he was unsure that God was calling him, but I don't believe that. Jonah was a prophet. This was his job. He knew the voice of God, and he may have had doubts from time to time, but I don't think he was unsure. I think he knew exactly who was talking to him. The other explanation we hear a lot is maybe Jonah was afraid. He was afraid to go to Nineveh, which makes a lot of sense. Nineveh was kind of a cultural capital. It was later an actual political capital of the Assyrian Empire. They were basically the reason the northern kingdom in Israel collapsed. So if you know the history of Israel, you know that Assyria came in and attacked the northern kingdom of Israel, and was part of the reason that it collapsed. So Assyria would have been seen as not only an enemy, but essentially the main enemy of Israel, and especially in that northern kingdom area. So a good example of this would be, a good metaphor possibly would be, if you had to go, say you were called to go to North Korea and stand in the middle of the street and preach, knowing full well that they not only didn't accept your religion, but that even politically, as an American, you were seen as an enemy to their country. Don't read too deep into that metaphor, but just for clarification's sake, they stood in direct opposition to what Jonah was about and what his God was about. But again, I don't think he was afraid. It's understandable why he would be, but we see even from the story, when it becomes apparent that he's the reason that they're in the storm, he offers himself up as a sacrifice. And you have to think too, as a prophet, he stood on many a street in many a city and called people's sins out right in front of him. He wasn't afraid really of anything, so I don't buy that either. He wasn't unsure. He certainly wasn't afraid. But I'll tell you what he was. He was prejudiced. Now that's a loaded word, but the truth of the matter is it fits here. He didn't like Assyrians. He didn't like Nineveh or any of the people that came from there. In essence, he believed that they didn't deserve to hear what God was warning them against. And that's kind of hard to hear because I think as Christians a lot of times we like to think of ourselves as loving and accepting of almost anybody. But that's the key, almost anybody, right? I think all of us have at least one person in our minds that we think, even in the deepest, darkest recesses of our mind, that they maybe don't deserve grace. And for Jonah, that was the people of Nineveh. He had heard from God. He'd worked for God. He'd done good things for the Lord. He honestly didn't believe that the people in Nineveh deserved to hear from God. So I want you to think about these things as we go through the next couple of weeks. And this week, as you meet with your small group or you meet with your family and discuss this, I want you to think about this. I have some other questions for you just to discuss. Have you ever run from God? And that's a big question. I know that's a big ask. So I'm not, if you're sharing this in life group, just, know that I'm not asking for full life stories or your deepest, darkest secrets. But if you've run from God, how did it end for you? If God's ever asked you to do something, even simple, and you decided you didn't want to do it for whatever reason, how did that end? The other question is, how do we know it's God? How do you know it's God? And I think that's an important question to ask, even if we don't know the answer. And if we don't know the answer, then talk with your life group, do some research on your own. You can call me, you can talk to me and ask me, how do we know the voice of God when we hear it? And the third and final one, and this is the one that I really want everyone to think about and discuss. How's God speaking to you now? What's he asking you about? How's God moving in your life to show you that he's present and that he's working to talk to you? So I want you to discuss all these things with your life group. I want you, like I said, to read through at least that first chapter in Jonah. Read through the whole thing if you can. No spoilers. You can read ahead if you want. I won't be mad. But go ahead and do that. Thank you for tuning in this evening. We look forward to seeing you next week. Grace and peace. God bless.